For the position of President of the National League of Cities, Mayor Ted Ellis of Bluffton, Indiana has been nominated. We did not receive any additional nominations by petition for the position of President. Therefore, I declare the nominations closed. Is there a second to the nomination? All those in favor of Mayor Ted Ellis for President of the National League of Cities say yes. Yes. All those opposed say no. I declare Mayor Ted Ellis elected President of the National League of Cities.
Unlike Mayor Coleman, Mayor Rogers, I brought a speech, and by golly, I'm going to deliver it today. First, want to acknowledge just my family. We've got a lot of people here from the state of Indiana, Matt Greller, and a bunch of my favorite mayors, buddies have been in trouble with me for a long time, Brendan Jackson and the Huffmans, who are good friends. My grandkids, Curtis and Ella and Abby and Keaton, my son Andy and son Scott and his wife Whitney, and Missy and daughter Becky, and of course wife Marge, who keeps the things running at home when I'm not there, which is quite frequently. Marge and I came here a little early tonight, or this afternoon, I guess, and walked in, and I asked her as we walked in, I said, in your wildest dreams, did you ever think we'd be standing here? And she looked up at me as she does so affectionately and said, honey, you're not in my wildest dreams. Well, these are interesting times, aren't they? These are times when history is literally bending, and no one knows that better than those of us who are in our cities and towns and villages. One summer day in 1891, Mayor Martin Walbert boarded a train car, set out on what would be probably the better part of a day's journey out of town. History was bending there, too. And as Martin left the city, he must have wondered what the future was holding for his community. Abroad, the European economy was already in recession. The U.S. was less than 2 years from its worst ever depression. At home, the public was clamoring for an end to the open ditch that was carrying human and animal waste along the south side of the city and into a major river. The public was demanding new streets be constructed to replace the muddy ones, but their demands exceeded their ability to finance those repairs. As a matter of fact, Martin's successor would bluntly describe the city's finances as follows. And he said, the city treasurer files its annual report showing the general fund overdrawn. This, of course, is occasioned by the extensive street repairs, and when we consider the extent of those improvements, we are only surprised that the treasury is in as good a condition as it now is. Try that in your next state of the city. The citizenry was restless over the immigrants, the Germans who didn't speak the language and who took jobs, they said, from the locals, and the Irish who had their own brand of English and who were reputed to drink and avoid work and take advantage of law-abiding citizens. Then there was the crime problem. You see, in those days when communication was slow at best, horse thieves and swindlers found it easy to slither into the city, commit their criminal acts, and blow town on the railroad. Maybe there was a shyster on the train with Mayor Walbert. In a rare, quiet moment as those train tracks clicked beneath him, it's not difficult to know what Mayor Walbert was thinking and feeling, because we've all been in that same place. Seemingly insurmountable problems, not enough money to fix them, constituents demanding more than they're willing to pay, and no doubt sometimes he questioned why he ever ran for office to begin with. It was this need to share information with other mayors from other cities that took Martin out of town that day. 10 other mayors would join it in this first such meeting of mayors in the United States, the very first recorded state league meeting. Now, elsewhere in the U.S., over the ensuing years, officials were coming to the same conclusion and seeking others out for the same reasons. And soon, other leagues began to form in other states. And in the 1920s, the state leagues joined others to form a league of state leagues, which eventually became the National League of Cities. Bluffton, Indiana Mayor Martin Walbert could not have known how his train trip that day would take him to the genesis of an organization that would one day affect millions of Americans. He could not have known that 120 years after the fact, we would still be dealing with environmental, transportation, immigration, and funding issues on the local level. What he did know, though, was that his and other communities faced problems and opportunities that transcended city lines and state borders. That he knew that sharing ideas and information was the best strategy for dealing with these issues. And they also knew that by speaking with one loud voice, they could make things happen. One of their first successes in lobbying was obtaining free use of that newfangled device, the telephone, for police and city business, including league business. Now, no doubt there was a great reluctance in our community to consider new approaches to these persistent problems. But for Martin Walbert, it was the difference between solution and stagnation. Such is our challenge today. The world has changed significantly in the last 30, 10, 5 years, and the very way we think about things is changing. A century later, all of us find ourselves with challenges that are centered on some familiar themes. For Martin, the problem was old. Criminal behavior, the escape of the criminal made easier by the advent of the railroads. And whereas conventional remedy probably would have been to track the criminal down and run him down on horseback, when they looked at that problem in a different way, not how do we catch him from behind, but how do we get ahead of him, the solution, telephone, became obvious. That solution was a collaborative effort of city officials daring to think differently. For example, the next time, and I know a lot of you get into the elementary schools, the next time you visit a first grade classroom, just take a look around and note how different it looks from the time when you were small enough to fit under one of those little desks. These children are learning and processing information differently than their parents or grandparents, and it's much more than the technology that they're using. It's that succeeding generations think differently than their predecessors. Our 6-year-old over here, Ella and Curtis, have never heard a busy signal on the telephone. They speak a different language than Papa does. They don't understand when I say, that sounds like a broken record. They'll never be told by their teacher, if you don't know how to spell it, look it up in the dictionary. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, Curtis, he's a big kid now, but when he was a little kid, about 3, he picked up a cassette tape on our kitchen table. Having never seen one before, thought it was a camera. But I'll tell you, he can out-operate any of it on a smartphone. These differences don't belong to the very young alone either. As National League of Cities, we're called to prepare the next generation and the next generation of elected officials for some uncharted roads that lie before them. Well, how do we do it? We do it by acknowledging who we are and remembering that we are the nation's oldest and largest organization of cities. And living in our cities, we need to remember are lots of people whom many still, and some of you would consider young. The median age in the United States is 36. That's the middle age. That means that half of the people that we serve, now not half the voters, but half the people we are called to serve are younger than 36. The youngest of the baby boomers is 47. Many of the elected officials who were elected last Tuesday and most of our constituents process information in ways different than their parents. If the National League of Cities is to maintain its reputation as the go-to authority on cities, we must, especially in these times, clearly understand what information this new generation needs and how we better be delivering. We must also clearly decide where we are going as an organization. Like Martin Walber, not chasing solutions on horseback, but using every resource at our disposal to look at challenges in just a little different way. And our focus as we do this must not extend just to the next election, but to the next generation. All the while, we need to remember that some of our challenges are immediate. We need to keep our eyes fixed on the horizon and our feet planted firmly on the ground. For we are called to speak the truth to power in Washington, whether it's politically correct or not, and to be a constant and determined advocate for this generation, future generations, and generations who are still here and do not have a voice anymore. How we do that is best exemplified by another Bluffton boy. About the same time that Martin took his train ride, and just a couple blocks from the train station, Lewis Scott and his wife were starting a family. Hello boy, they named him Lewis Everett Scott after his father, but they called him Everett. As a kid growing up, Everett just wanted to play baseball. That's all he wanted to do. And when this scrawny kid, about 130 pounds, graduated from high school in 1909, the Red Sox, then the Yankees, took a chance on him. Now, this was an era of Ty Cobb when the players regularly sharpened their spikes on their shoes and weren't afraid to use them as they slid into second or third base to cut the legs of the middle infielders while they were sliding. And over his career, Everett endured punishment after punishment after punishment of playing with injury. But he was a pretty good shortstop. And he was there every day, even when his legs bore cuts and scars, and even once when an eye injury almost rendered him blind. He was there, contributing to the team's work for a record 1,307 consecutive games, including 27 World Series games. That record would only be broken by Lou Gehrig, and then later by Cal Ripken Jr. Everett Scott still holds the third all-time spot on the list of consecutive games played. Now, many days, Everett must have limped onto that field wondering why he played a game. Wondering where the next batter could hit a line drive speeding toward your head, or wondering why he was on a field where base runners came with knives on the bottoms of their shoes trying to take you out of the game, and where the expectation was that you'd shake it off and be ready for the next play. Well, none of us needs reminding, do we, that the coming year is going to be filled with lots of posturing and rhetoric on the federal level, because we do have a presidential election coming up. And even while the campaign rhetoric rages, we need to remind our federal officials that there is serious work to be done, election be hanged, so that we can begin to bring the prosperity that our citizens deserve in our cities. Most of us are going to find ourselves, whether we like it or not, in the midst of some campaign. And when it gets crazy out there, just go to the refrigerator. Grab that jar of mayonnaise and read the instructions to yourself. Keep cool, do not freeze. Keeping our cool doesn't mean we won't bear down. The National League of Cities is staffed by a great and talented bunch of people who give it their best every day to gather the knowledge and the information that we need to meet today's challenges. But when baseball games are to be won, you don't send the team trainer in the bat. You don't ask the equipment manager to pinch run or the third base coach to play first base. You see, it's the staff's job to provide us with the information we need and the tools. But it's up to us, one at-bat at a time. Because we know how to take a high, hard line drive and still throw the runner out. We know what it's like to have someone come at you with spikes up, cutting into your person and still be ready to play the next day. We know what it's like to lace up your shoes, run onto the field even when you don't feel like it, and still play the game. One more thing. Babe Ruth and Everett Scott roomed together for 5 years on the road. And it mattered very little how many home runs Babe Ruth hit in the game, unless Everett Scott was there in the infield, throwing out opposing runners one by one by one, day in and day out. We need to be there too on such a regular basis. When other elected officials need us for ideas, need us for experience, need us support, we must be there. When our members of Congress need to hear that phone call or contact from home, we need to be there, even if we'd rather spend a little time in a quiet corner somewhere. Because we spoke about that first grade classroom that looks different than it did decades ago. But one thing looks the same as it did then. The expressions of wonder and hope on the 6-year-old faces. And who, in what will seem like an instant, will be leading the cities and towns that we hold so dearly. We owe them cities and towns and villages of opportunity, leadership, and good governance. And we'll do it not with our Babe Ruth-style home runs, but with our Everett Scott-style tenacity. Bobby Kennedy reminded us that few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events, and in the total of those acts will be written the history of our generation. In the total of those small acts will be written the history of our generation and theirs. Thank you very much. Let's get to work, shall we?